What is existential isolation? Individuals are often isolated from others and from parts of themselves, but underlying these splits is an even more basic isolation that belongs to existence. An isolation that persists despite the most gratifying engagement with other individuals and despite consummate self-knowledge and integration. Existential isolation refers to an unbridgeable gulf between oneself and any other being. It refers to an isolation even more fundamental. A separation between the individual and the world. Separation from the world. That seems to be the right phrase, yet still it is vague. One of my patients provided an embodied definition. She experienced periodic panic attacks that occurred whenever her relationship with a dominant other was endangered. When describing her experience, she said to me, "Remember the movie West Side Story, when the two lovers meet, and suddenly everything else in the world mystically fades away, and they are absolutely alone with one another? Well, that's what happens to me at these times. Except there's no one else there but me." Another patient had a recurrent nightmare that dated back to early childhood and now, in adulthood, resulted in severe insomnia. In fact, in a sleep phobia, since he was terrified of going to sleep. The nightmare is unusual in that the dreamer himself suffered no harm. Instead, his world melted away, exposing him to nothingness. The dream. I am awake in my room. Suddenly I begin to notice that everything is changing. The window frame seems stretched and then wavy, the bookcase is squashed, the doorknob disappears, and a hole appears in the door which gets larger and larger. Everything loses its shape and begins to melt. There's nothing there anymore, and I begin to scream. Thomas Wolfe was forever haunted by his unusually acute awareness of existential isolation. In the autobiographical Look Homeward, Angel, the protagonist, muses on isolation, even while an infant in the crib. Unfathomable loneliness and sadness crept through him. He saw his life down the solemn vista of a forest tile, and he knew he would always be the sad one. Caged in that little round of skull, imprisoned in that beating and most secret heart, his life must always walk down lonely passages. Lost. He understood that men were forever strangers to one another, that no one ever comes really to know anyone, that imprisoned in the dark womb of our mother, we come to life without having seen her face, that we are given to her arms a stranger, and that, caught in that insoluble prison of being, we escape it never, no matter what arms may clasp us, what mouth may kiss us, what heart may warm us. Never, 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 never. Existential isolation is a veil of loneliness which has many approaches. A confrontation with death and with freedom will inevitably lead the individual into that veil. Death and existential isolation. It is the knowledge of my death that makes one fully realize that no one can die with one or for one. Heidegger states that though one can go to his death for another, such dying for can never signify that the other has had his death taken away in even the slightest degree. No one can take the other's death away from him. Though we may be surrounded with friends, though others may die for the same cause, even though others may die at the same time, as in the ancient Egyptian practice of killing and burying servants with the pharaoh, or in suicide pacts, still at the most fundamental level dying is the most lonely human experience. Everyman, the best-known medieval morality play, portrays in a powerful and simple manner the loneliness of the human encounter with death. Everyman is visited by death, who informs him that he must take his final pilgrimage to God. Everyman pleads for mercy, but to no avail. Death informs him that he must make himself ready for the day that no man living may escape away. In despair, Everyman hurriedly casts about for help. Frightened and, above all, isolated, he pleads to others to accompany him on his journey. The character Conrad refuses to go with him. Ye be a merry man. Take good heart to you and make no mono. But one thing I warn you, by Satan. As for me, ye shall go alone. As does every man's cousin who pleads that she is indisposed. No, by Our Lady. I have the cramp in my toe, trust not to me, for so God me speed. I will deceive you in your most need. He is forsaken in the same way by each of the other allegorical characters in the play. Fellowship, worldly goods, and knowledge. Even his attributes desert him. Beauty, strength, and discretion. When death bloweth his blessed, they all run from me full fast. Every man is finally saved from the full terror of existential isolation because one figure, good deeds, is willing to go with him even unto death. And indeed, that is the Christian moral of the play. Good works within the context of religion provide a buttress against ultimate isolation. Today's secular everyman who cannot or does not embrace religious faith must indeed take the journey alone. Freedom and existential isolation. The loneliness of being one's own parent. To the extent that one is responsible for one's life, one is alone. Responsibility implies authorship. To be aware of one's authorship means to forsake the belief that there is another who creates and guards one. Deep loneliness is inherent in the act of self-creation. One becomes aware of the universe's cosmic indifference. Perhaps animals have some sense of shepherd and shelter, but humankind, cursed by self-awareness, must remain exposed to existence. Erich Fromm believed that isolation is the primary source of anxiety. He especially emphasized the sense of helplessness inherent in the human being's basic separateness. The awareness of his alienances and separateness, of his helplessness before the forces of nature and of society, all this makes his separate disunited existence an unbearable prison. The experience of separateness arouses anxiety. It is indeed the source of all anxiety. Being separate means being cut off, without any capacity to use my human powers. Hence, to be separate means to be helpless, unable to grasp the world, things, and people actively. It means that the world can invade me without my ability to react. This fused effect of loneliness. Helplessness is an understandable emotional response to our finding ourselves inserted, without our consent, into an existence not of our choosing. Heidegger uses the term thrownness to refer to this state. Though one creates oneself, one's project, what one ultimately fashions for oneself is limited by one's having been thrown alone onto the easel of existence. If am I a religionist? Not only do we constitute ourselves, but we constitute a world fashioned in such a way as to conceal that we have constituted it. Existential isolation impregnates the paste of things, the bedrock of the world. But it is so hidden by layer upon layer of worldly artifacts, each imbued with personal and collective meaning, that we experience only a world of everydays, of routine activities of the day. We are surrounded at home in a stable world of familiar objects and institutions, a world in which all objects and beings are connected and interconnected many times over. We are lulled into a sense of cozy, familiar belligerence. The primordial world of vast emptiness and isolation is buried and silenced, only to speak in brief bursts during nightmares and mythic visions. Yet there are moments when the curtain of reality momentarily flutters open, and we catch a glimpse of the machinery backstage. In these moments, which I believe every self-reflective individual experiences, an instantaneous dephemizologionist occurs when meanings are wrenched from objects, symbols disintegrate, and one is torn from one's moorings of at-homeness. Albert Camus, in an early work, described such a moment when he was in a hotel room in an alien country. Here I am defenseless in a city where I cannot read the signs, without friends to speak to, in short, without diversion. In this room penetrated by the sounds of a strange city, I know that nothing will draw me toward the more delicate light of a home or another cherished place. Am I going to call out? Cry out? Strange faces would appear, and now the curtain of habit, the comfortable tissue of gestures and words, wherein the heart grows sluggish, rises slowly and finally unveils the pale face of anxiety. Man is face to face with himself. I defy him to be happy. In these moments of deep existential anguish, one's relationship to the world is profoundly shaken. One of my patients, a highly successful, hard-driving executive, described such an incident. It lasted only a few minutes, yet was so powerful that it retained its vividness 40 years later. At the age of 12, he was sleeping outside, looking at the sky, and suddenly felt himself separated from Mother Earth and drifting between the stars. Where was he? Where did he come from? Where did God come from? Where did something, rather than nothing, come from? He felt overcome with Alanenses, with helplessness, and with groundlessness. Though I find it hard to believe that lifelong decisions are made in an instant, he insists that then and there he decided he would make himself so renowned and mighty that he would never again have this feeling. Of course, this empty, lost, this enfranchising experience is not out there. It is within us, and no external stimulus is necessary to find it. All that is required is an earnest inward search. Robert Frost phrases it beautifully. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces. Between stars, on stars where no human race is, I have it in me so much nearer home, to scare myself with my own desert places. When one falls into one's own desert places, the world is suddenly unfamiliar. At these times, Kurt Reinhardt says, something utterly mysterious intervenes between him and the familiar objects of his world, between him and his fellowmen, between him and all his values. Everything which he had called his own pales and sinks away, so that there is nothing left to which he might cling. What threatens is nothing, no thing, and he finds himself alone and lost in the void. But when this dark and terrible night of anguish is past, man breathes a sigh of relief and tells himself, it was nothing after all. He has experienced nothingness. Heidegger uses the term uncanny, not at home, to refer to the state in which one loses one's sense of familiarity in the world. When one, the sign, is totally involved in the familiar world of appearance and has lost contact with one's existential situation, Heidegger considers one to be in the everyday fallen mode. Anxiety serves as a guide to lead one back, by way of unconscience, to awareness of isolation and nothingness. As Dasein falls, anxiety brings it back from its absorption in the world. Everyday familiarity collapses, being and enters into the existential mode of the not at home. Nothing else is meant by our talk of unconscience. In another passage, Heidegger states that when one is brought back from absorption in the world and objects are divested of their meaning, one experiences anxiety at confronting the world's loneliness, mercilessness, and nothingness. Thus, to escape inconvenience, we use the world like a tool and absorb ourselves in the diversions provided by Maya. The world of appearances. The ultimate dread occurs when we confront nothing. In the face of nothing, no thing and no being can help us. It is at that moment when we experience existential isolation in its fullness. Both Kierkegaard and Heidegger were fond of wordplay involving nothing. Of what is man afraid? Of nothing. The Italian filmmaker Antonioni was a master at portraying dephysicologists. In many of his films, for example, the eclipse objects are seen in stark clarity, with a kind of cold mysteriousness. They are detached from their meaning, and the main character simply drifts past them, unable to act, while everyone around her goes on busily using them. Dephysicology involves more than objects in the world, other entities invented to provide structure and stability. such as rules, values, guidelines, rules, ethics, can similarly be stripped of meaning. In Chapter 5, I described a simple disidentification exercise in which individuals list answers to the question, "Who am I?" on cards and then meditate upon the experience of giving up, one by one, each of these roles. For example, a man, a father, a son, a dentist, a walker, a reader of books, a husband, a Catholic, or Bob. By the time the exercise is completed, the individual has divested himself or herself of all roles, and becomes aware that being is independent of accoutrements, that one persists, as Nietzsche said, even after the last cloudy streak of evaporating reality. Some of the fantasies reported by subjects at the end of the exercise, such as a disembodied spirit gliding in a void, suggest clearly that role divestment propels one into an experience of existential isolation. Experiences where one is alone, and everyday guidelines are suddenly stripped away, have the power to evoke a sense of the uncanny, of not being at home in the world. The hiker who loses his or her way, the skier who suddenly finds himself or herself off the trail, the driver who in a dense fog can no longer see the road. The individual in these situations often experiences a rush of dread, a dread independent of the physical threat involved, a lonely dread that is a wind blowing from one's own desert place. The nothing that is at the core of being. Uncanny are the social explosions that suddenly uproot the values, ethics, and morals that we have come to believe exist independently of ourselves. The Holocaust, mob violence, the Jonestown mass suicide, the chaos of war, all of these strike horror in us because they are evil. But they also stun us because they inform us that nothing is as we have always thought it to be. That contingency reigns, that everything could be otherwise than it is, that everything we consider fixed, precious, good can suddenly vanish, that there is no solid ground, that we are not at home here or there or anywhere in the world. Growth and existential isolation. The word exist implies differentiation, exist to stand out. The process of growth, as Rank knew, is a process of separation, of becoming a separate being. The words of growth imply separateness. Autonomy, self-governing, self-reliance, standing on one's own feet, individuation, being one's own person, independence. Human life begins with a fusion of ova and sperm, passes through an embryonic stage of complete physical dependence on the mother, into a phase of physical and emotional dependency on surrounding adults. Gradually, the individual establishes boundaries demarking where he or she ends, and others begin, and becomes self-reliant, independent, and separate. Not to separate means not to grow up, but the toll of separating and growing up is isolation. The tension inherent in this dilemma is, in Kaiser's term, the human being's universal conflict. Becoming an individual entails a complete, a fundamental, an eternal and insurmountable isolation. Fromm makes the same point in Escape from Freedom. To the extent to which the child emerges from that world, it becomes aware of being alone, of being an entity separate from all others. This separation from a world, which in comparison with one's own individual existence is overwhelmingly strong and powerful, and often threatening and dangerous, creates a feeling of powerlessness and anxiety. As long as one was an integral part of that world, unaware of the possibilities and responsibilities of individual action, one did not need to be afraid of it. When one has become an individual, one stands alone and faces the world in all its perilous and overpowering aspects. To relinquish a state of interpersonal fusion means to encounter existential isolation with all its dread and powerlessness. The dilemma of fusion isolation, or as it is commonly referred to, attachment separation, is the major existential developmental task. This is what Otto Rank meant when he emphasized the importance of birth trauma. To Rank, birth was symbolic of all emergence from embeddedness. What the child fears is life itself. It becomes clear now that existential isolation and interpersonal isolation are intricately interwoven. Emergence from interpersonal fusion thrusts the individual into existential isolation. A dissatisfying state of fusion existence or too early or too tentative emergence leaves the individual unprepared to face the isolation inherent in autonomous existence. The fear of existential isolation is the driving force behind many interpersonal relationships and is, as we shall see, a major dynamic behind the phenomenon of transference. The problem of relationship is a problem of fusion isolation. On the one hand, one must learn to relate to another without giving way to the desire to slip out of isolation by becoming part of that other. But one must also learn to relate to another without reducing the other to a tool, a defense against isolation. Bugental, in his discussion of the problems of relatedness, plays on the word apart. The human being's basic interpersonal task is to be at once a part of and apart from. Interpersonal and existential isolation are way stations for each other. One must first separate oneself from the other in order to encounter isolation. One must be alone to experience alonences. But, as I shall now discuss, it is the facing of alonences that ultimately allows one to engage another deeply and meaningfully.